my presentation, can you hear me? I'd like if you would take yourselves back to the stage, certainly, that my 9-year-old is at the moment, which is not the position of necessarily a sophisticated analysis, but a deep-set, inherent assessment. Is it fair? My 9-year-old's favourite cry is, "Dad, it's not fair." So move to one side from the quasi-academic legal assessment as to, or the economic assessment as to whether investment treaties actually serve their fundamental purpose of encouraging investment. And step back, and I invite you to make a cruder assessment as to whether or not the process is fair, and what can we as practitioners do in terms of making it a fairer process. Now, I start with, as an Englishman, the epitome of fairness. Now, I'm not going to explain to you the rules of cricket. It would take longer than we have, but there are many similarities between cricket and investment treaty arbitration. A full-blown cricket match can last 5 days. Not bad for an investment treaty hearing. Large numbers of people, frequent breaks for tea, intense boredom, and at times total terror. And quite often it ends up with a draw. Now this is a picture of the cricket ground at Lord's in London. And I invite you to look at that grass. That is some of the most manicured grass that you'll find in England. So here it is. Here is my epitome of a level playing field. A level playing field for whom? States and investors. This process is nothing if those who come out of it do not feel that they have had a fair crack of the whip. They've undergone a process which, even if the outcome is not what they hoped for, they respect the rules of the game, a recognition that there has been fair play. And I suggest there's a question mark about whether many who participate in investment treaty arbitration do come out of the process with that as an assessment. I'll look briefly at some statistical evidence, which, frankly, ends up going both ways as to whether the process is a fair one or not. I'll look at some practical issues which affect how far the process can be said to be a fair one. Look at what we can do, particularly those who represent and advise states. What can we do in terms of helping level up the playing field? A quick look at some tactics that we've seen in recent years a number of states resort to, and analyse how far those tactics are a desirable response on the part of states to perceived unfairness in the process, and draw some fairly brief conclusions. 2009, an analysis was undertaken by Susan Frank, published in Columbia Foreign Direct Investment Perspectives. Now, the upshot of the analysis here was that, in broad terms, investors and governments won and lost in equal measure. Superficially, that might suggest a degree of fairness. There were as many winners as losers, 50-50, broadly split. Now, of course, that depends on what the underlying merits of the claims were. When investors won, they ended up with a lot less than they requested. Wow. Earth-shattering. Susan Frank concludes that a respondent's development status, how far the state was rich or poor, was not itself a reason why investors were successful in pursuing claims. Well, no great surprise there. And why a party wins or loses has a lot more to do with merits of the claim than the state of economic development. Again, hardly surprising. Although I'd suggest that the simple costs, the simple scale of expenditure involved in mounting an effective defence of an investment treaty claim and the depth of pocket available to fund that expense has almost inevitably an impact in terms of the final outcome. Wherever academics involved, there'll be another academic who comes along and disagrees with the first one. Kevin Gallagher published a paper a few months ago and criticised Susan Frank's analysis, suggesting that there had been an inadequate sampling size, suggested that developing countries in fact are subject to a disproportionate number of claims as against their share of global foreign investment or as against the number of BITs that are a proportion of worldwide BITs that they are a party to. And relevant to government budgets and in per capita terms, developing countries pay significantly more in damages than do developed nations. Again, no great surprise there. So where does the academic analysis take us? In truth, not very far. It might be that we're better off with a 9-year-old's assessment. It doesn't feel fair. It doesn't look fair. Do BITs actually serve the purpose for which they were originally drafted? Now, there's a separate question, of course, which is how far in the process of negotiating investment treaties, how far is there a rigorous analysis as to the scale of benefit that is likely to accrue from an investment treaty? How far is negotiating and signing BITs simply a fashionable thing to do? One of my colleagues has I think, really put a finger on it in terms of why did so many states agree to become signatories to the Energy Charter Treaty? Well, it's a little like in the UK when you're 17, you get a driving licence. Why do you get a driving licence? I'm an adult, that's what adults do. Well, maybe entering into and negotiating investment treaties is something that some states do because others do it. How far is there really a proven benefit from a state negotiating and signing an investment treaty? Again, the academic analysis goes both ways. Some surveys suggesting that there is, in broad terms, a corollary, and others suggesting that really there isn't. And it's not too difficult to look at states with very, very few investment treaties, Brazil would be an example, but who have been spectacularly successful in attracting foreign direct investment. Now, again, stepping away from the academic analysis, I'd like to suggest that the common sense test is something that I've called the investment banker test. A slightly unpopular term, perhaps, these days. But now, many of my university friends, going back a few years, they're now investment bankers. They spend a lot of their time advising people on where they should place their investment and how they should do so. Now, I'm not such a bore that every after-dinner conversation turns to the subject of investment treaties, but on occasions it has happened. And my investment banker friends don't know what bilateral investment treaties are. Even less do they know what multilateral investment treaties are. Now, I suggest they may not be alone in the investment banker world in knowing very little and frankly caring less as to the world of bilateral investment treaties. Now, if that little example is true, are we as lawyers operating in a sort of a bubble? And in the real world, people that significantly influence foreign direct investment, those operating in the financial markets, if they don't know very much or care very much about bilateral investment treaties, it's hardly surprising, is it, if it turns out that there isn't a great corollary. However, that is essentially an analysis and a question for historians. The fact is we've got them. The fact is we have however many thousand bilateral investment treaties it is, and there are many more in the process of being negotiated. I suggest because in reality it is something diplomats and trade officials can and should do as part of the process of building, of seeking to develop bilateral trade relations. It is something that you do as part of that process. It is a choreographed step in the dance that leads to broader, deeper bilateral trade relationships. In truth, that's why we continue to see new bilateral treaties negotiated. But harking back to some of Stephen's observations, it would be very wise for those involved in that process to pay very close attention to some of the perceived and actual shortcomings as part of that process. The most obvious practical distinction for those of us who act for states as well as acting for investors is the question of funding. Now, what does it cost to defend fully a significant bilateral investment treaty claim? Well, I'm not going to put a figure on it, lest I run the risk of pricing DLA Piper out of the market. But it is a significant sum of money, a very significant sum of money. If the job is going to be done properly, then it will require specialist lawyers. It will require support from the best forensic accountants. And there are few of the best lawyers, and there are few of the best forensic accountants. In terms of the pool of available lawyers, there are new players, there are new entrants. It is a broader pool. It's very encouraging to see states insisting on a degree of capacity building where international law firms are engaged with a view to ensuring that there are lawyers in the states that face claims well able to play a full role in defending these cases. But defending a full-blown bilateral investment treaty claim will never be a cheap exercise. There has been talk from the World Bank of project loans being made available, but very little use made of that. Some law firms have gone down the path of providing pro bono support, but again, that has inherent limitations. The greatest change and the greatest perversion of the playing field in the last 4 to 5 years, I suggest, has been the fact that while the pool of funding available to states has not changed, the pool of funding available to investors has changed markedly for 2 reasons. The first is the willingness of firms to act on contingency fee bases in terms of bringing claims against states. And the second, and I suggest more significant, is the advent into the market of third-party funders. I think everybody in the room, I imagine, receives emails and flyers from insurance companies, quasi-hedge funds, wanting to invest in this area. People with pots of money are actively going out and seeking investors who wish to bring a claim. And that is new. Now, what can states do to level up the playing field? Very big question and very few clear answers as far as that's concerned. But do be aware that there are many sources of funding available to investors, and that is something which is likely to render the risk or the cost element of bringing a claim on the part of investors less significant in the coming years. This, I think, is probably the area where states have greatest potential influence in terms of correcting the position. Whom do you appoint? Now, nobody would seriously suggest that states should go out and find people that have a deep leaning towards that state because of a personal connection or a political connection. Such an arbitrator will readily be discounted on a tribunal. But it is true that there is a relatively small group of arbitrators who understand governments, who have grown up in governments. The vast majority of practitioners in this area are certainly people like me, who have grown up as commercial lawyers. Some of us were fortunate enough to study public international law at university and have come back to practicing it and find it the most intellectually stimulating and rewarding area of practice that there is. But most of us have not grown up with the same view of public international law that absolute PIL purists have. People who have spent 30 years advising a state on the whole gamut of public international law, not simply investment and trade-related law, the whole picture. And I would suggest that one of the reasons for a particular view of the role of public international law in the investment treaty world is that the vast majority of arbitrators have come to this area relatively late in life. They see the world through 30 or 40 years of training as commercial lawyers. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's only part of the picture. So one thing states can definitely do is seek to appoint arbitrators who are familiar with government, who do not see it as inherently suspicious that a state takes a period of time to recover potential documents, that a state has accountability issues, that there may be real problems in terms of a sovereign securing assistance and documentation and evidence from a federal entity. People who have simply grown up with that as part of their daily life. There are very few such individuals, and states are well advised to cooperate and pool experience and knowledge as to who those people are. A third area where close attention needs to be paid, and where there may need to be a great deal of explanation given to tribunals to ensure that adverse inferences are not drawn, is in terms of the availability of documentary evidence. Now, for many states, it is a far, far harder exercise to secure access to documentation than it may be for a well-organised investor, for all sorts of fairly straightforward reasons. Not the least of which is that there are very, very few instances in this area of tribunals being brave enough to impose fairly strict prescription periods. So the idea that would prevail in the vast majority of commercial disputes, that if you're not going to find yourself going back more than 6 years, or maybe 12 years at the very most, it's not particularly uncommon in a bilateral investment treaty environment to find yourself trying to find documentation going back 15 years, possibly through 2 or 3 civil wars in the process. Now that poses real problems for states, and it's crucial, in particular for states, it's crucial that bilateral investment treaty tribunals understand that and appreciate the evidentiary issues that states in particular face. State secrecy and disclosure issues. It's not the tribunal that's going to face the repercussions that a civil servant may face if documentation is disclosed in breach of state secrecy rules. Very important that tribunals are encouraged to understand the implications that civil servants and those participating in the process may face domestically if they're not very, very careful. The degree of care that's required in this area will mean that it takes states longer than it might take investors to adhere to document production timelines. Again, very important that those issues are communicated fully to tribunals and that tribunals take the trouble to understand what they are. Availability of material where it's the sovereign, obviously, facing the claim, but it's the federal entity which has the documents, and sophistication of archiving processes. What can and should be done by states in terms of seeking to level up the playing field? Well, there are some obvious clauses which, on renegotiation, I would suggest states that should pay very close attention to. Stephen has highlighted some specific examples that states might like to follow. More generally, umbrella clauses and MFN clauses, I would suggest particularly close attention should be paid to in terms of areas which can give rise to unfairness and which don't, I suggest, have a material impact on how far investors are encouraged to invest. I've already suggested that a cadre of ex-government public international law specialists should be identified and promoted. And if events like this, where those involved, particularly from the state perspective, are brought together, if these sorts of events can happen more often, that will be a very positive angle as far as this area is concerned. Promotion of funding mechanisms, including donor funding. Now, there are examples of donors, donor states, particularly Scandinavian states, providing funding for vulture fund litigation facing states where highly indebted countries are on the receiving end of such claims. If states can provide donor funding in those situations, then I would suggest it's entirely appropriate that donor funding is similarly available in circumstances where highly indebted and impoverished states face this type of claim. Now, that requires a degree of sophistication, a degree of understanding on the part of donor states. And it would be no bad thing if perhaps law firms cooperated with NGOs. Certainly in the UK, Oxfam has taken some steps in this direction towards ensuring that there is an awareness of the positive role that funding can play in ensuring that states are in a position to instruct law firms able fully to defend them. Ensuring an awareness of pitfalls within the government process. Now, that's easier said than done, but an education exercise in ensuring that civil servants are aware of the obvious pitfalls. And finally, an insistence upon the transparency of the process. It is very, very easy for arbitrators who have grown up in the closed-door, confidential world of contract-based private law arbitration to assume, wrongly, that the same attitude and the same approach should prevail in the bilateral investment treaty world. And it is largely for states to insist that that is not so. There is quite rightly an element of democratic transparency as far as the defence of bilateral investment treaty claims are concerned. And it's for states and their council to bring that to the attention, however unpopular they might make themselves, of tribunals, and insist that the democratic responsibilities of state defenders are respected, recognised and respected. Very briefly, there's been a degree of attention over the last 18 months in terms of examples of various states who are suggested to have behaved badly, perhaps partly as a reaction to the perception that the process is not necessarily a totally fair one. Examples include exerting pressure on arbitrators, active intimidation, obstruction of legal representation, concealment of documents, under the umbrella of a legitimate exercise of government powers. If you want to see examples of that, you only need to look on the listserv and the blogs. There are various colourful examples. Yes, such examples do exist. In truth, they're fairly limited, and there are many things that tribunals are able to do effectively to address that sort of misbehaviour. I would suggest in reality it's in part a product of the equivalent of the blog serves and the tabloid press. There are such examples, but there's a risk in perceiving them as prevailing more generally than they do. How far is it really a problem? I think not really, would generally be the response. So, what can and should states do? Firstly, appoint carefully. Appointing the right arbitrator, somebody who understands the process, who is a fully trained public international lawyer, somebody who doesn't see the problems that states face as unusual and fully recognised and has a degree of sympathy and understanding with those problems. That is, by a very long chalk, the most important thing. Ensure that tribunals understand the issues, communication with the tribunal in terms of practical issues that states are facing in complying with problems like production of documents is always a good thing. Silence on the part of a state, perhaps because of difficulties giving clear instructions to counsel, will always be a mistake. Insistence on respect for democratic processes, at the end of the day, tribunals will recognise and will understand what these issues involve. States are not alone in recognising the problems with the investment treaty arbitration process. There are a number of NGOs, I mentioned Oxfam in the UK, who do recognise the problems and do recognise the impact that this can have. There is a role for those NGOs, and states should not be afraid from engaging with those NGOs. For example, the role that NGOs can play in the provision of amicus briefs. We've seen that in a number of the Argentinian cases. A powerful amicus brief from a respected NGO in the context of an investment treaty claim which has the potential to have an adverse outcome for the citizens of a developing state, that can be a very powerful tool. Perhaps active promotion of domestic dispute resolution processes, so that where there is a fork in the road provision in the treaty, the domestic choice is a very real and meaningful choice. Not an easy path to follow, but an obvious path to follow. And finally, where we finally do get to the stage of renegotiating and renewing treaties, is that something we should do? Has the world moved on? Is this something that is really, frankly, is it needed any longer on the part of a number of more developed states? I'd suggest probably not. Is it something which really secures a meaningful benefit for more impoverished states? The evidence doesn't point to a clearly positive answer, and there's a fair body of evidence that suggests treaties don't. So think carefully about entering into new treaties and renewing treaties, and pay close attention to some of the points that Stephen illustrated earlier. So there you are. I haven't given you an explanation of the rules of cricket, but if anybody would like to, please speak to me at the break. Thank you.